Hi, anyone and everyone. Welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam, and today we're going to talk about the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which I teased a little bit in our Northumberland ghost ship episode with Lauren. But this is a topic that has always been interesting to me, and essentially my whole family. I feel like we've spent a lot of time talking about the Edmund Fitzgerald as a kid. But before we get into it, I do want to let all know about some of the changes to the show. I did announce this on Instagram and TikTok last week, but since I'm currently doing the show solo, I need to go to an episode every other week. I wish I could maintain the weekly episodes, but I really don't have enough hours in my day. So, at least for a little while, maybe longer, I don't know. I'm going to go down to once every 2 weeks, see how it goes, see what sort of groove I can get myself into, and we'll just kind of go from there. So, with all of that being said, let's dive into the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And I had a lot of debate with this one and exactly how I wanted to cover it. I feel like if I had the time, I could do hours long episode on this, but I am going to keep it fairly simple. Big reason why is it would take me hours and hours and hours just to research, and then it would just delay this episode quite a bit further. So I'm going to try to take a simpler approach. This might end up being a bit of a shorter episode, but I tried just to go into the timeline of everything that happened and try to discuss some of the theories because there's a lot that we don't know. But the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was a freighter ship that traveled the Great Lakes on November 10th of 1975. It sank, and it took all 29 passengers to the bottom of Lake Superior with it. To this day, as I was just kind of mentioning, there's a lot of speculation for the reasons why the Edmund Fitzgerald had sank. And there's a handful of theories that kind of all make sense. But we'll go through some of those. But like I said, people don't actually know why it sank. And we'll get into the reasons of why it's such a mystery to begin with. But the Edmund Fitzgerald was built in 1957 by Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Northwestern Mutual worked with Great Lakes Engineering Works of Ecorse, Michigan, to build a ship that would be the largest to travel the Great Lakes, at least at that time, 1957. The ship was 730 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 39 feet tall. It was designed to carry taconite pallets, which are iron ore pellets. And its typical route would be from Superior, Wisconsin, where it would be loaded up with these pellets. And then it would travel to Detroit, Michigan, and Toledo, Ohio. So it would go from the far west end of Lake Superior all the way east and connect through, I think it's a Sault Ste. Marie lock will connect it down to Lake Michigan. It can continue on to other Great Lakes. I believe that they all have the ability to be traveled and connected by water. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Great Lakes or not from the States, they are in like the northern Midwest of the States and kind of stretch east. There are 5 lakes in total: Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. And they were formed during the last glacial period about 10 to 20,000 years ago. Essentially, it was a massive slab of ice the size of Canada and the northern United States that fully covered that area. And as that ice would shift over time, it would carve depressions into the land, which created the lakes. And Lake Superior, where the Edmund Fitzgerald sank, was the largest and deepest lake From east to west, Superior is 350 miles wide, and it is 160 miles tall from north to south. And it is also the deepest lake, so it's 1,332 feet deep, which is just mind-blowing to me because I've spent so much time on Superior, and that's a very, very deep lake. And being the largest and the deepest also makes Superior very treacherous, particularly in November. And we'll get into why November itself is a very dangerous time. But as I just kind of said, I've spent a lot of time along Lake Superior, and even at its shores, the waves can be incredibly large and crashing onto the rocks. I know I've seen a lot of areas where the waves have created these blowholes because of the constant just beating down on the waves on the rock. And there have been recorded waves on Lake Superior that are 35 feet tall. And that's crazy to me, but it's also so fascinating because it has very ocean-like tendencies. It has a tide and a current, but it is a natural water lake. And if you listened to our Incorrect Lores and Legends episode, which was episode 52, you may remember me talking about Copper Harbor, Michigan. And Copper Harbor is one of the largest natural water harbors in the world, which is on Lake Superior. And this is where I spend a majority of my time. The storms Superior typically sees in November that can cause those 30, 35-foot waves are typically due to the cold air coming from Canada and meeting the warmer air that is over Superior that's coming from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And that collision of these two drastic temperatures create a violent gale force winds. And I've seen a few articles that describes it as rivaling a hurricane. And it's like, it gets very intense. I've never been up there for a really big storm before, but I have definitely been there for just kind of smaller to moderate storms. And it gets very intense right along the water there. And even when it comes to snow, I know we talked about that quite a bit in the Incorrect Lores episode, because the whole area is just fully blanketed in snow. And I have seen like people's driveways and things that they have to plow just to get into their home, where it just creates massive walls of snow that they literally had to dig through, whether it's with a plow or a shovel or whatever it is, just to get through. So this area gets quite a bit of drastic weather. And in November of 1975, Lake Superior was seeing a low pressure storm system. And the storm system started November 8th in southwest of Lake Superior, over the United States at this point, not over the lake, but it was moving towards Lake Superior. And as the storm continued to move towards the lake, a gale warning was issued at 2:39 p.m. on November 9th. And a gale warning is issued in marine areas like Superior, and it's something I actually frequently see in Chicago, since the city is right along Lake Michigan. But this warning is saying that there is either sustained wind or strong gusts of wind that can lead to dangerous conditions due to the winds being at least 34 knots or 39 miles an hour, and it's expected to last at least 2 hours. A gale warning can be escalated to a storm warning once the speed reaches 45 knots or 55 miles per hour. So there's essentially different categories. It starts with a gale warning, moves up to a storm warning. And as I was saying earlier, these winds have the ability to create multiple stories tall waves. And from my research, I will say, This research is pretty elementary. So maybe I'm wrong. I tried to read a ton of different sources and break it down into a simplistic form, and I might be 100% off base with this. The size of the waves have many different factors, including the size of the water's surface. So, Lake Superior, being the largest Great Lake, has the biggest surface area. So, it has the ability to generate larger waves. And from the analytical descriptions I've read, the surface of the lake kind of acts like a glass of water. You know how water molecules bond to each other? And you could have kind of like a curve of water over that edge of the glass because they're holding on to each other. If you were to do an experiment where you had two different size glasses and basically filled up to the top, and if you were to bump the table, the glass that has the smaller surface area is going to be more likely to spill. You're going to see the movement of that water, but it's not going to be necessarily as drastic as it would be in the larger glass with a larger surface area. And if you actually match the size of the waves it creates, you're going to see that the larger surface area is going to have a larger wave and it's less likely to spill. It's going to hold on to each other more, and they're going to have the ability to make a stronger bond because of that. So Lake Superior works similar to how that is, being a larger surface area similar to the larger glass. I hope that's right. It made sense as I was researching it, but that kind of just gives you the idea of how Lake Superior can generate such large waves versus potentially the other Great Lakes. So just kind of keep that in mind in how Superior is able to generate these massive waves as we go throughout our timeline here. So let's go back to November 9th, and this is going to be shortly before that gale warning was issued. The Edmund Fitzgerald was loaded with 26,116 tons of iron ore pellets. Then by 2 p.m., the ship departed Superior, Wisconsin. So this is shortly before that gale warning. And Superior, Wisconsin is in the far southwest side of Lake Superior. And it began to make its journey towards Detroit, Michigan, which is 746 miles away. So this had a pretty long journey to make. By 2:34, just over half an hour after the ship had departed, that first gale warning was issued. And another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, that was only traveling about 15 miles away from the Edmund Fitzgerald, radios over to the Edmund Fitzgerald about the gale warning. And the captain of the Anderson, Captain Cooper, spoke to the captain of the Fitzgerald, Captain McSorley, and they both acknowledged the gale warning, but they both felt that they were able to continue their journeys if they continued a little bit further north away from the shore, and that would hopefully allow them to go around the worst of the storm. So both ships continued their routes just as they had discussed. The Fitzgerald had reported weather around 7 a.m. the following morning. It said that the winds were around 35 knots and waves were around 10 feet high, which that's high, but that's not very abnormal, and it is able to still maintain control and not really worry too much about it. And around 3 p.m., in the afternoon of the 10th, Captain Cooper from the Anderson reported hurricane force winds of 75 knots. He said that he felt like the Fitzgerald was also too close to sixth fathom Skoal, which for himself, he would not be comfortable with in his ship. And Six Fathoms Shoal is an area off of Caribou Island that has a dangerous reef. So Captain Cooper was saying that he would not want to get that close because he would feel there was a risk of hitting that reef. And it was around this time that Captain McSorley radioed Captain Cooper, and there's actually a transcript of this conversation. Captain McSorley said, "Anderson, this is the Fitzgerald. I have sustained some topside damage. I have a fence rail laid down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. I'm checking down. Will you stay with me till I get to Whitefish?" Captain Cooper responds, "Charlie, on that Fitzgerald, do you have your pumps going?" And Captain McSorley responds, "Yes, both of them." So that was short, but in that transcription, we can hear McSorley asking Cooper to stick close to him just in case anything happens, because he's already having some issues. And he's basically saying, like, if things continue to go bad, can you be our rescue? That's essentially what that conversation says. And the conversation happened around 3:30 p.m. And around 4:10 p.m., Miss Gorley informed Cooper that both of their radios were down and that he needed the Anderson to provide radar plots to make sure that they were still on track with their route. Then between 5:30 and 6 p.m., the Fitzgerald contacted another ship, the Ava-4, and he informed them that both radars were down, and during the conversation, the captain of the Ava-4 could hear Captain McSorley yelling at his crew to keep off of the deck. And he tells the Ava-4 that the Fitzgerald has a bad list. And if you listen to my Eastland disaster episode a few weeks ago, you'll know the impact of a bad list and what can happen. So McSorley said that he is taking high seas onto deck, essentially saying massive waves are coming up over the deck and crashing onto it, and that this is the worst weather conditions he has ever seen in his 44 years as captain. So this is certainly rough, what they're going through. And at 7:10 p.m., Captain Cooper radioed over to Captain McSorley to check in. And at this point, Anderson was about 10 miles from the Fitzgerald, so he had definitely made up some distance, because when they left Superior, Wisconsin, he was about 15 miles away. So he was gaining, I think, about a mile an hour was what the transcript said. But he's slowly getting closer to the Fitzgerald. And they're still providing updates. Since their radars are both down, they're still constantly communicating to make sure they're on track. And they let them know that 9 miles ahead of the Fitzgerald, so 19 miles ahead of the Anderson, there was another ship. And it was just basically to make sure that they were on track to pass each other without any other incident. And 5 minutes later, the Fitzgerald entered a squall, which is essentially an abduction, most commonly due to the weather and the storm. And it makes it so the Fitzgerald doesn't appear on the Anderson's radar. And this isn't necessarily an uncommon occurrence. And given the situation with the storm and the down radar systems, this made this situation particularly dangerous. And by 7:20 p.m., Captain Cooper reported to the Coast Guard that he could no longer see the Fitzgerald and it wasn't coming back up on radar. By 7:50 p.m., when the Fitzgerald was still not returned onto the radar, Anderson notified the Coast Guard again. And it is believed that within minutes of the Fitzgerald disappearing from the Anderson's radar, that it had fully sunk by then. And even potentially by the time that the Anderson had contacted the Coast Guard, within 10 minutes of the squall, that it had sank at that point. And the severity of the storm made it incredibly difficult to send help to the Fitzgerald, especially since they really only had a rough location because of the last time it was seen on radar. They didn't have additional communication to figure out where exactly the ship could have continued on to. And unfortunately, the Coast Guard didn't have the resources to venture out into the storm to search for the missing vessel. So they actually contacted the Anderson around 9 p.m. and asked if they could help support the search. And by this time, Anderson was close to Whitefish Bay, which is on the far eastern side of Lake Superior. So he basically made it across the whole length of Superior. And by Whitefish Bay, it is a much calmer area, and Captain Cooper didn't like the idea of going back out into rough waters. So he had a long conversation with the Coast Guard, and he was putting up the argument that he didn't want to put his men at risk. But after pleading from the Coast Guard, he said he would give it a shot. But he would only give it a shot if he felt like he had the ability to protect his men, and that's what comes first for him. And something to note during all of this, the Fitzgerald had contact with the Anderson until 7:10. It is believed that by 7:20, maybe 7:30, the ship had gone down. And there was no distress signal from Captain Miscorley. This happened so fast, it doesn't seem like they even had the opportunity to attempt a distress signal. And in just a moment, we'll get into what happened specifically, or what we believe happened specifically at the time of it sinking. But within 20 minutes from the last communication, as I mentioned previously, it is believed that the Fitzgerald had sunk below the surface of Lake Superior and was unfortunately unable to be rescued. So the Anderson went out, and unfortunately nothing came of this search. There was no sign of the Fitzgerald on the surface. And remember in the conversation we had earlier about the waves, the Anderson is still dealing with all of that during the search. The storm is still happening. And they ended up returning to Whitefish Bay without any updates on the Fitzgerald. And over the next few days, the Coast Guard sent out ships and planes in an attempt to locate the Fitzgerald. And they were able to identify 2 large pieces of wreckage. And these pieces of wreckage were at the bottom of Lake Superior in 535 feet of water, only 17 miles from Whitefish Bay. And this was the Fitzgerald. They almost made it to Whitefish Bay. The ship had split into 2, and the lifeboats were damaged, but they were still secured to the ship. And this was a big factor that led experts to believe that the ship had sank very quickly after that last communication. And according to weather.gov, there are a couple theories why the Fitzgerald sank, while the Anderson, that was very close to the Fitzgerald during their whole trip, made it to Whitefish Bay safely. First, the Fitzgerald was fully loaded with iron ore pellets. I've seen some sources talk about it being potentially overloaded. In the research I used for this, they don't really go into that, but I have seen some documentaries in the past that have brought that up. So I'm not really sure if that's the case, but minimally it was fully loaded to its maximum weight with iron ore pellets. And this would cause the ship to sit lower in the water. And it would also give the larger waves more opportunity to splash up onto deck and potentially flood the ship. This theory goes along with the theory that the hatches to the compartments where the iron ore pellets were kept maybe weren't secure. And there's a lot of debate with this one. Again, I have seen documentaries where they've done all different sorts of tests and tried to recreate it, and they have had leaks. Because basically, as the ship is designed, where most of the center of the ship are these very large compartments. And that's what gets loaded with the iron ore. And so it's an attempt to balance out the weight. And they don't load one compartment fully. They'll load them all bit by bit to make sure that weight is constantly balanced throughout the ship. And then there are these large hatches that go on the top that's on deck level. And they're supposed to be water seal and obviously incredibly strong hatches. So there's some beliefs that those hatches leaked and that water was getting into those compartments with the iron ore pellets, which obviously would just add a whole lot of extra weight. It would lower the ship in the water level even further. But there's also been a lot of discussion, which I believe was mentioned specifically on the SS Fitzgerald organization website, saying that they were sealed properly, that is not true, that there was potential leaking. So I am going to choose to go for the official organization website with what they said in their research. But if that were to happen, just as an if, there's just no way to drain that water. So that would just add the extra weight. So the next theory is going back to something that the Anderson had mentioned. Captain Cooper said that he wouldn't have felt comfortable getting close to 6 Fathom Skull. And what if the Fitzgerald did get too close and did actually hit the reef and cause damage? There's a few things that I have thoughts with this theory. I would assume Captain Mascoli would know that he hit the reef, but honestly, I'm not too sure. If you're in such an intense storm, you might not realize that you hit something. You might assume a wave hit you, but I honestly, I'm not entirely sure. But if that were to have happened and there was damage done to the ship at that point, as it continued, that would just continue to leak water into the ship, and that could potentially be the cause for the sinking. And there's also the conversation of the fact that it was split into 2 pieces at the bottom of Lake Superior. And what if the damage just got so bad that it just essentially broke the ship based on where that pressure was with that water coming in, with the weight of the iron ore and a wave hitting it. All of those factors could have made the structural damage to the ship. So there's a lot of different kind of thoughts that come with that. But my question is, what is the likelihood that Captain Mascoli would know that he had hit the reef and then also not mention it? Honestly, I don't know. So as I was mentioning earlier, the SS EdmundFitzgerald.org discusses some theories, and they have kind of this whole list of theories that involve waves. So I'll just kind of read a couple for you because I'm not sure if I can explain them myself any better. So these are direct quotes coming from the website. So they say that a wave engulfed the ship, pushing the front of the ship underwater, then hit the ground and broke in 2. So this is a very interesting one to me, because this is basically saying a very large wave that was taller than the ship came over the top of the ship, and it essentially put so much pressure and weight of the water on that deck, which the deck is designed to just to have the water run off of it and back into the lake. And so if this wave hit that deck and it was just kind of too much for the front end of the ship to handle, it's basically saying that that water pushed the bow underneath the surface of the water, causing kind of the back to prop up a little bit, but then the weight of that iron ore caused the break because there was no longer an equal balance of the ship on the water. I hope that makes sense. In my head it does. We'll see. You guys let me know. Another theory that it says on the website is waves lifted both ends of the ship, bow and stern, but the center of the ship containing the cargo was not held by a wave. So the overload force of the center downward sinking and or breaking the ship in two. So that's basically saying two waves came and it was fairly balanced where one wave was at the bow, one wave was at the stern, but below the center of the ship, there was no water. And again, this is a similar idea. There isn't a balanced weight across the whole length of the ship. And so the weight of the iron ore, without that water essentially holding it up, had forced the ship to break into two. And obviously, if it's breaking into two, the outcome is that it's going to sink. So another theory is that it was bottoming out or grounding, and this could have very well happened near 6 Fathom Shoal. So this is kind of what I was talking about a little earlier, where I was unsure of what was happening, if Captain Muscoli had realized that he could have hit the reef or not. But it's basically that same idea where it's like if he had kind of scraped the ground and even gotten a handful of holes that were much smaller, that wear and tear throughout his journey would just have gotten worse, causing it to sink later on as it's a little further away from 6 Fathom Shoal. So the next one talks about the faulty hatch, and it says, with an asterisk next to it, this theory has been disproven by research and expeditions. So again, that's why I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but I will say I have seen documentaries that have gone very deeply into this idea, and they don't all agree. But then the next one is previous structural damage that caused the sinking. So that's certainly possible. I don't really know a whole lot about that. I didn't see a whole lot about that in my research. And I just kind of thought of something, which I didn't put in my script at all. Let's go back to the conversation with 6 Fathom Shoal. Captain Muscorley did say the ship had a list. There's a few reasons that the ship potentially could have a list. It could be damage, so water coming in from underneath and causing the ship to lean, or you're getting hit by these massive waves. You could have the iron ore pellets shifting because they're pellets. They're smaller. They have the ability to almost move kind of fluidly. So if these massive waves are hitting the ship, those could get shifted with it in it, causing the list. If they get shifted and they all kind of push towards one side, that would make sense, causing a list. But what if the list was due to the damage of it bottoming out or scraping along the reef? I don't know. It's just a thought I had while recording. But next theory that they bring up is huge waves swamped the ship and sank it. Many people call these huge waves so big that they're actually detected on radar, the Three Sisters. And this is something I've definitely heard before, and it's fascinating to me. These waves, like typically on radar, you're not going to be seeing waves. But these are so incredibly large that they actually do get detected on radar. And it would be understandable if the Fitzgerald was hit by one of these waves, that it could have been absolutely devastational to the ship. But I don't know if there's necessarily record of these huge waves. I will get into a little bit in basically the next paragraph from weather.org, or excuse me, weather.gov. That's going to break down a little bit more of a wave theory. But this is entirely possible. And then the last thing that they say on the Edmund Fitzgerald.org website is a huge wave rode up between two swells and snapped it in half. So that's kind of what we've been talking about a little bit, but a slightly different version of it. But it's essentially the same idea, where two waves came and collided with the ship, and the pressure from those waves cracked it in half. So they all make sense to me. I do have some questions, but I think a lot of that is just kind of like nitpicky details to help me understand. But in addition to those theories from the SS at edmundfitzgerald.org, weather.gov also had mentioned two large waves had hit the Anderson. And potentially one or both of those waves could have caused the incident and caused the Fitzgerald to nosedive. And this kind of goes along with that first theory we discussed from the ssEdmundFitzgerald.org site, where a wave came up over the bow of the ship, pushing that bow below the surface level of the water, and then the stern up. And due to the weight of that iron ore inside of the ship, and there's so much weight that is now shifting inside, as I said, those pellets kind of act fluid, put the weight towards that bow, and essentially had it nosedive, kind of like a missile underwater. And to me, that theory makes a whole lot of sense. And both of these websites seem to kind of agree that this is a very viable theory. But that's terrifying. And it also discusses the fact that it broke in half, and that they're unsure if it broke in half above the surface of the water or below. And given this theory, both seem to be pretty equal likelihood. As the bow went into the water and the stern is kind of sticking up, it could have been kind of what we believe happened in the Titanic, where just that weight broke it in half, sticking above the water, and then both halves sank quickly. Or it could have been the impact with the ship hitting the ground at the bottom of the lake, and that pressure broke it, because that weight is causing so much power for it to sink. When it hits the ground, it kind of shocks the ship, and had the potential to break it in half. So that's kind of like the rough outline of the Edmund Fitzgerald. I don't want to necessarily leave you on a sad note, but it is unfortunately very sad that Captain Miscorley, who was a veteran captain of 44 years, this was supposed to be his last voyage, and he was retiring after he finished this one. And I think that also goes to the conversation of how quickly this all happened. You have a veteran captain who has had so much experience captaining ships across Lake Superior, and unfortunately, there was nothing he could really do. But to leave you hopefully on a slightly happier note, I'm going to do something that I typically don't do. So if you made it this far in the episode, thank you. Hopefully this is something exciting for you. But next week, I am hoping to record with my sister, Ashley, and we are going to discuss songs about true crime or songs about crime in general. And we are going to cover Gordon Lightfoot's song called The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald that came out in 1976. This episode is going to come out on Thanksgiving Day, so remember 2 weeks from now. And we're going to dive into the lyrics. I also have a few other songs already planned that I'm going to take Ashley through. So if you have any recommendations, let me know. I would really love to continue to make this a series. I know it's been a long time since we did the first one, but I really want to get back into it. So let me know if you have recommendations. But thank you all for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? If you liked this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And you can follow us on Spotify. You can find us on YouTube at Have You Heard About This Case, on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, on TikTok at HYHATC, or you can email us at haveyouheardaboutThisCase@gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll talk to you later.